Released in 2000 for the Nintendo 64, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was the highly anticipated sequel to The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask chronicles Link's journey after the end of Ocarina of Time and introduces gamers to the world of Termina, a parallel version of Hyrule. Here, Ganon and Zelda have no influence, a major departure from most of the games in the series. Instead, the Skull Kid and his wiles lead to most of the game's conflicts. When he steals Majora's Mask from the Happy Mask salesman, Termina is cast into despair as the mask comes to life and commands the moon to crash into the earth. When Link arrives, there are just 3 days remaining until the moon crashes down completely. Over the course of these 3 days, Link must free the 4 giants, one for each of the 4 main areas of the game, and summon them atop the clock tower to stop Majora once and for all. Majora's Mask has had a long and storied history that pretty much started when it was released. The game and its mechanics are centered on an in-game clock, lending the game to speedrunning from the very beginning. Throughout this video, I'm going to take you on a tour through that history, covering the people involved, the tricks, the glitches, and everyone and everything in between. This is... The earliest questions in Majora's Mask speedrunning revolved around how many cycles were required to beat the game. When you play Song of Time, time resets to the dawn of the first day and a new cycle begins. Players are incredibly limited in the first cycle of Majora's Mask, being restricted to only the Deku form and having extremely limited access to any useful items. Even to this day, although first cycle skips are tantalizingly close, the first cycle is still required. Therefore, it was quickly realized that 2 cycles would be the absolute minimum to beat the game. With this in mind, one of the earliest speedrunning categories in Majora's Mask was the best second cycle completion category. The objective of this category was to arrive at the clock tower as early as possible in the second cycle with all of the boss remains and the Oath to Order. In other words, this category minimized the in-game time required to complete the game rather than the real time. Why not just beat the game rather than stopping at the clock tower door, you might ask? The door at the top of the clock tower that leads to the final boss doesn't open until midnight on the 3rd day. With the routing and runner skill of the era, it hardly mattered how well you played the game, since you'd have to wait until the door opened anyway. It didn't matter if you arrived at the door at 2 in the afternoon on day 1 or 11:59 on night 3. The door doesn't open until a set time regardless. Furthermore, in-game time doesn't pass after entering this door and reaching the moon, so it seems runners of the era saw very little value in completing the entire game. Unfortunately, there isn't much documentation for the progression of this category given that it lived and died entirely before YouTube and Twitch. In fact, the first Majora's Mask forum posts on Speed Demo's archive didn't even pop up until early 2005. However, we do know that in April of 2004, runner Dragorn reached the door at 8:32 PM on night 2. Dragorn might have played a little bit fast and loose with the rules that didn't actually exist yet by only recording the second cycle. Although untimed, during the first cycle he spent an enormous amount of time grinding rupees for the adult's wallet and collecting heart pieces. Still, the rules didn't actually exist yet, so obviously he didn't break any, and it's very much worth noting this particular run as the first completed speedrun of Majora's Mask. The only real trick used in the run was a clip through the East Clocktown Guard. Dragorn's run was also done on the GameCube version, which was very quickly demonstrated to be the worst version for speedrunning the game by far. It's painfully laggy and very unstable, often crashing on a whim. As might be expected, this run had very unoptimized movement and routing. Movement often boiled down to rolling or even walking in straight lines. In addition, he made some very interesting choices in combat, and other than the clip through the East Clocktown Guard mentioned earlier, there were essentially no tricks or glitches to speak of. That being said, this is all completely understandable when you consider the fact that Dragorn was the community in 2004. He didn't have the community that we have today or any of the luxuries we have, so this was still an incredibly impressive first speedrun of Majora's Mask. With his submission, Dragorn stated that he believed it would be possible to reach the door before nighttime of the second day, over 2.5 in-game hours faster than his run. Such a run would require segments that were perfectly optimized, but those optimizations were put on hold in favor of In 2005, runner TSA took to the SDA forums to ask if users had any ideas for what full game speedruns might look like. Various routing ideas and some of the first useful speed techniques were discussed and worked on by the community. Backwalking, a technique that is commonplace today, was demonstrated to be the fastest form of basic movement. Ideas for making the clock tower door opening only at midnight less of an issue were also discussed. Quick little side note. Before I get too far into talking about TSA's run, I do want to point out that TSA has been proven to be a cheater in other games like Ocarina of Time. So far, no one has shown his Majora's Mask run to be cheated, but it would be a bit remiss of me not to make a small note of it. Regardless of whether or not his run was cheated, he was an important figure in the early history of the game, so he's definitely worth mentioning. Anyway, after tinkering with these new ideas and thinking fourth dimensionally, the first full game segmented run of Majora's Mask was completed by TSA throughout May 2005. In these days of speedrunning, segmented runs were vastly more popular than the real-time attack or RTA runs of today. Segmented runs were broken up into different segments, usually at certain save points throughout a game. TSA broke his run up into 15 segments. The temples were done in their intended order, and there were still very few glitches or tricks to speak of. It was certainly more optimized than Dragorn's run, but for the most part it was still a fast, casual playthrough. This all being said, TSA's run was the first to minimize the duration of the run in real time as opposed to in-game time, and although Majora's Mask any percent runs in modern times are exclusively timed via the RTA method, TSA's run can be considered the very first any percent speedrun of Majora's Mask. Segmented runs aren't timed the same way as current real-time speedruns, but the general estimate of the total real-time of TSA's run is approximately 4 hours and 13 minutes. Even for the era though, the community quickly realized they could do better. In July 2005, runner PYH189 completed an 18-segment run in 3 hours and 37 minutes. In less than a month and a half, the community shaved 36 minutes off of the world record. This isn't too surprising considering these were the first two any percent runs in the history of the game, but what changes were made to the route to allow for such a large time save? One major change was the removal of Epona from the run by using the Goron mask in some very clever ways. PYH utilized a new technique known as Goron damage boosting by taking damage at the peak of a Goron pound to skip needing Epona to enter both Great Bay and Iconic Canyon. This also meant though that PYH couldn't obtain the Gara mask. This introduced a very difficult new seam walk to skip obtaining the mask to summon the hookshotable tree at the top of the cliff in Ikana. PYH also grabbed a third bottle, which enabled him to collect all of the Pinnacle Rock eggs in one trip, and the Gilded Sword, which shortened all of the fights in the game. After PYH's run, Majora's Mask entered a bit of a dark period. No records were set in either any percent category for the next 2 years. Although documentation from this period is also very scarce, it is clear that the community actually focused more on the best second cycle completion category rather than the full game run categories. In July 2007, runner Petrie911 began routing an updated best second cycle completion run that aimed to include several years worth of new tricks over Dragorn's run. Over the course of the entire year of 2007 and the first half of 2008, Petrie uploaded segments of his run agonizingly slowly to YouTube. In June 2008, before Petrie could complete his run, runner Soul Calibur 2 completed his own. Soul Calibur 2 reached the clock tower door at 2:23 AM on night 1, a full 18 in-game hours faster than Dragorn's previous world best. This was the first run to use a glitch known as super sliding, a movement technique that occurs when shielding damage while grabbing an object. If done correctly, the damage source will send Link straight backwards at the maximum speed allowed by the game. Except for Goron Missile, but that's a story for another video. The boat ride in the swamp was skipped for the first time in this run by using a very unique method of the Big Octo skip. If you see up while using the Deku mask, you can just side hop around the Big Octo. After obtaining the Song of Soaring and hitting the Woodfall Owl, Soul Calibur 2 went to the mountains via a new trick to clip through the ice in North Termina Field. This trick has been simplified in recent years, but Soul Calibur 2 used a trick known as hovering. Hovering utilizes the Infinite Sword glitch, or ISG, and ISG occurs when you interrupt a crouch stab with an action such as picking up a bomb or reading a sign. You can't fall or jump off of ledges with ISG active, and if you shield damage while in the air with ISG active, the game places you in a grounded state. In this state, you cannot fall down and are thusly hovering. As we'll very soon see, hovering completely shattered most of the obstacles within the game and opened up an unbelievable number of routing opportunities. One major application of hovering in this run was the skipping of the Elegy of Emptiness by hovering up Stone Tower. There were other smaller applications of it as well, such as hovering over the gap at the beginning of the Pirate's Fortress to skip the entire sewer section, and hovering over the boulder at the beginning of the Goron race to skip the Powder Keg. Soul Calibur 2's run is also notable for being the first to complete dungeons in their non-intended order. After opening up all of the soaring points and obtaining the necessary items, Soul Calibur 2 started with Snowhead and then proceeded to be Woodfall, Stone Tower, and he ended with Great Bay. This all being said, Soul Calibur 2's run would be the last serious attempt of the least in-game time category. At this point, the community completely moved its attention to real-time runs, despite some stragglers momentarily sticking to the best second cycle completion category, and the community's attention has remained there to this day. In the months after Soul Calibur 2's run, a massive new real-time run was in the works. From November 2008 to February 2009, Mr. Grunz, known today primarily for his efforts in the TAS community, worked on his own segmented real-time run. Mr. Grunz's run was as much of a leap forward over PYH's run as PYH's run was over TSA's. It used an enormous amount of new tricks, the gameplay was absolutely top-notch for its time, and the general route structure was the first to have any real polish. Mr. Grunz skipped the Moons tier in the first cycle by using an angled backflip to grab the ledge of the clock tower, which also skipped the Bomber's hide-and-seek minigame. Skull Kid cutscene skip was also performed for the first time in his run by simply hovering over the cutscene trigger. All of the previously mentioned tricks introduced in Soul Calibur 2's least in-game time run were also found in this run and pushed to their absolute limits. Long stretches of land were cut down by super slides and Goron movement, hovering was used to skip large portions of dungeons, and there were plenty of other new tricks such as the angled jumps in the Pirate's Fortress to skip the pirate fights. Overall, this was an extremely solid run for the time, coming in at 2 hours and 27 minutes. Unfortunately though, it was done on an emulator. Emulators are a touchy subject in many speedrunning communities, mostly due to inaccuracies that can occur when games are emulated. Mr. Grunz's run was accepted as a demonstration for what Majora's Mask was capable of, but it wasn't accepted as a true record. Driven forward by the hype of Mr. Grunz's insane run, the community exploded yet again with huge new finds. Over the next few months, no runs were completed due to the sheer number of new finds that needed to be incorporated. Runner Giano showed the most interest of anyone in assimilating all of these new tricks we'll be talking about into a single segment run, which would be a first for Majora's Mask. Whereas previous runs were segmented as previously mentioned, Giano aimed to complete the run in one sitting with no resetting of the console. This would be an important paradigm shift for the community, as many of the new tricks were considered to be extremely difficult, even perhaps tasks only, so putting them all together in one sitting would require runners to become more skilled than they had ever been before. This period of time marks the beginning of the modern era of Majora's Mask speedrunning. In August of 2009, Giano completed what could be considered the first single segment run of Majora's Mask with a 2 hour and 11 minute run. In those days, most speed games were timed with what is known as SDA timing, which generally started from gaining control of the player and ending at the final meaningful input of the run. In the context of Majora's Mask, this means that timing actually started after the opening cutscene ended. This timing method was used by the community until 2011, but for the purposes of this video, I will only be referring to run times as they would be measured by present-day timing standards. Giano's 211 integrated everything the community had found in the months after Mr. Grunz's 227. Rather than starting by collecting the Goron mask like Mr. Grunz and Soul Calibur 2, Giano hovered over the Great Bay Wall and obtained the Zora mask immediately at the beginning of Cycle 2. After obtaining the Zora mask, Giano performed a new glitch known in those days as a fairy fountain wrong warp to warp from Great Bay to Akana Canyon. In Majora's Mask, all of the fairy fountains exist on the same map. No matter what fountain you actually enter, the collision and the loading zones of the other fountains are loaded as well. By utilizing hovering, one can hover out of one fountain and into another, allowing ridiculously large sequence breaks to any of the 5 major areas of the game at virtually any time. Fairy Fountain Wrong Warps and Grotto Wrong Warps, which operate on the same principle, are still used in every single glitched category to this day, though the community has renamed them to Alternate Exits to avoid confusion with other similar glitches. Giano's run also featured the new Bottle Duplication glitch, which was found by Glitches and Stuff. The game handles transactions in the Curiosity Shop by overwriting an empty bottle over the bottled item you tried to sell to the shopkeeper. After confirming the transaction, there is one frame on which you can pause and equip a different item over the item you tried to sell. If you do this, the game overwrites an empty bottle over the item you swapped in, rather than the original item. Using this glitch, Giano duplicated bottles over his Deku Nuts, Deku Sticks, and the Bremen Mask, preventing the need to obtain any legitimate bottles other than the first one from the Witch in the Forest. This allowed the Pirate's Fortress to be completed in just one trip, rather than the 2 Mr. Grunz required. Lullaby Skip was also done for the first time in this run. Lullaby Skip is very difficult on the English version of the game for several reasons. The invisible Goron causes wind to blow in the area, and this wind is what keeps you from normally reaching the temple without the Goron Lullaby. The first wind always happens at the same time when you enter. On the Japanese version of Majora's Mask, you can slash your sword during this wind to prevent yourself from falling off the edge and get ISG afterwards to keep yourself from falling off for the remainder of the trick. Unfortunately, this doesn't work on the English version. Instead, you have to get ISG before the first wind blows, which is extremely precise. And due to the differences in the way that the voiding in the area works on the English version, you only have one chance. In fact, it was so precise that the technique known as pause buffering was developed to make it more consistent. In the N64 Zelda games, you can queue actions in what is known as unpause lag, allowing you to do inputs frame perfectly. As a side effect of skipping the lullaby, the Goron Mask and the Lens of Truth were also skipped for the first time. As if all of those tricks weren't enough, Mr. Grunts himself also discovered boss key skips for all 4 of the dungeons, although only the ones for Snowhead and Great Bay Temple were deemed viable for runs. The Snowhead boss key could be skipped with a simple recoil flip through the door, and the Great Bay boss key could be skipped with some out-of-bounds hovering. Giano also collected the Razor Sword to shorten boss and mini-boss fights, though Bottle Dupe removed the need for completing the Goron race for the bottle, so the Gilded Sword was skipped. Using this route and these tricks, Giano cut his time down several times over the next month, settling on a time of 2:06:25 on September 6, 2009. Over the next year or so, Giano completed at least 2 more runs, achieving a 2:02 or a 2:01 and a 1:58 by SDA timing according to IngX24. But his 2:06 is the last run for which there is video evidence until his final PB on August 9th, 2010.
Yo, this is Giano, and this is my Majora's Mask in 1:53, 1 hour 53 minutes, and I have some other commentators here with me.
This is Cosmo.
Sup kids, I'm Siglemic.
I'm Patreon911.
And this is your favorite Ring Rush.
Giano's 156 was the first record to be achieved on the Wii Virtual Console version of Majora's Mask. The VC version of the game is significantly less laggy than the N64 version, making the game several minutes faster. Though the change in version accounts for a lot of the time save over his previous PBs, this run featured plenty of new tricks and routing. In the fairy fountains, a Zora damage boost to the pillars surrounding the fairies was found, which saved many bomb shoes. In Majora's Mask speedruns, bomb shoes are at an absolute premium. Around this time in the game's world record progression, it became very important to limit usage of bomb shoes to save trips to the bomb shop to purchase more. As a matter of fact, there were several tricks introduced in this run that cut down on bomb shoes, including the introduction of mega flips and mega side hops. Mega flips and mega side hops are techniques that can be used to travel large distances in a relatively small number of bomb shoes as compared to normal hovering. These tricks had been known for years, but they were mostly unnecessary due to the number of bomb shoes that previous routes had. That all being said, Giano did buy more bomb shoes before Woodfall Temple to allow for the Woodfall boss key skip that he couldn't do before. Giano also completed Woodfall in just 1 trip rather than coming back in a second trip with the hookshot, and with Woodfall out of the way, Giano didn't need the Deku Mask anymore. This allowed him to dupe a bottle over it rather than making a detour for the Bremen Mask. Without the Deku Mask, there wasn't an easy way to get into the Woodfall Fairy Fountain to wrong warp to Snowhead anymore though, so that warp was moved to the Great Bay Fairy Fountain. Inside of Snowhead itself, Giano performed a trick known as Scarecrow Skip, which is an extremely precise hookshot that removed the need for learning the Scarecrow song. At the top of Stone Tower, Giano used another new glitch, known as Time Stop, to skip hovering to the entrance of the temple. While targeted and with a bottled item in hand, you can press the shield button followed by the bottle button 1 frame later to enter Time Stop. Essentially, the game considers you to be in a cutscene when this happens, which allows you to ride the block at the top of Stone Tower. He also avoided obtaining the Giant's Mask entirely, instead opting to fight Twinmold exclusively with arrows. This change was a major contribution towards skipping the Razor Sword as well. Finally, he performed the Stone Tower Temple boss key skip, utilizing Mega Flips to their utmost potential to deal with a small number of bomb shoes. Other than that, Giano's 156 was more or less the same as his previous runs, other than some small movement optimizations throughout the run. Giano's 156 would stand as the world record until March 2011, when a relative newcomer would arrive on the scene and take it by storm with a ridiculous new record.
Yeah, this is AX24, and this is my Majora's Mask run in 1:49, 1 hour and 49 minutes, on the Nintendo 64 version of the game. I have some guys here to help me commentate.
I'm Elminster.
I'm Petrie911.
I'm Dark Eye.
And I'm the legendary Casual.
In March 2011, a runner by the name of ingx24 completed one of the hallmark runs in Majora's Mask 80% history. He completed his run on the N64 version for personal reasons, but this actually did have an interesting effect on gameplay. The Virtual Console version of the game has a very large dead zone on the control stick, which affects a trick known as the Hyperextended Super Slide. Hyperextended Super Slides, also known as Hesses, are basically super slides during which you can change direction. This trick requires holding the absolute minimum amount on the control stick that the game can register, known as ESS position. This is much easier to do on the N64 version, as the N64 version does not have the same dead zone issues as the VC version. Ing was a pioneer of the Hess, and he used it anywhere and everywhere possible. Ing's run also saw the widespread use of mega flips for the first time, with around 30 mega flips being used in his run. That being said, mega flips proved to be an issue for the community. Unfortunately, on the English version, mega flips would often crash. For a mega flip to work, you have to input a backflip and then immediately cease holding down on the analog stick. If you hold down for too long, you lose speed on your mega flip, which makes them entirely useless. However, if you hold down on the analog stick until the frame where the explosion gives you speed, and then release the analog stick, the game will suffer from what is known as an A-slide crash. Other than the obvious crashing issue, this essentially required all mega flips to be pause buffered, and pause buffering is very slow, especially on N64. Ing obviously wanted to prevent needing to pause buffer as much as possible. To combat this, a technique was developed where runners would flick the control stick forward immediately after performing the backflip or side hop input rather than just letting go of it. This immediately removed almost all cases of accidentally crashing the game, and it saved a massive amount of time every single time one of those tricks was performed. The first major departure from Giano's previous record was the introduction of a glitch known as Flying Zora. On the English version of the game, you can fly through the air as Zora if you start a Zora swim under some specific circumstances. Ing used this glitch to fly to the Great Bay Fairy Fountain, saving quite a few explosives. Quite a few cutscene skips were also introduced in this run. For example, the New Wave Bossa Nova cutscene gives you the song as soon as you pull out the ocarina to begin the cutscene. So if you interrupt it by pulling out the ocarina again in a particular 2-frame window before the cutscene actually begins, you can soar away and still have the song. The Turtle Rising cutscene can be skipped in a similar way, and although Turtle cutscene skip was known in Giano's time, Ing was the first to perform it in a record. With all of these new tricks, Ing obtained a time of 1:52:55. It can't be understated how much of an improvement this run was over the previous record in more ways than just the final time. Unbuffered bomb tricks such as mega flips were a gigantic leap forward for the game, and introducing harder tricks such as the hyperextended super slides to the run allowed for much more optimized movement. For years to come, despite being beaten, this run would stand as a testament to how far the MM community was willing to go in the name of speed. Ing's record would stand for well into 2012. By 2012, the community had begun to move away from its SDA roots in some aspects. For example, the community shifted to a truly modern timing system, starting from the file select screen rather than upon gaining control of Link. The community also decided to remove the requirement of runs being single segment, instead opting for a truly RTA timing method. This allowed the console to be reset during runs, which allowed for numerous cutscene skips. Despite all of this, no one seemed to be able to match Ing's times. Not until a Japanese runner by the name of SVA16162 entered the picture, that is. On May 22nd, 2012, SVA would set the first new Majora's Mask 80% record in 14 months. SVA opted to run on the Japanese version of the game, which as we'll see was the faster version of the game for several reasons. He also ran on the Virtual Console version, and from then on to this day, the record has remained on the Virtual Console. The first major difference in SVA's run was a result of the switch to RTA timing rather than single segment timing. After playing Song of Time for the first time at the top of the clock tower at the end of the first cycle, the game saves automatically. If you reset after this save, you can skip the entire cutscene that plays there normally. This was previously known but disallowed, but with the rule change in place, it became faster to skip this cutscene by a huge margin. At the beginning of this run, SVA no longer went for the adult wallet, instead opting to do the run with the basic wallet. The extra carrying capacity wasn't really necessary anymore, especially since the Razor Sword was no longer being obtained in runs. One interesting new addition to the run was the ability to enter the lower entrance in the Pirate's Fortress hookshot room. On the Japanese version only, the guards in Pirate's Fortress have decreased vision at nighttime even inside. Using this and the fact that pirates cannot catch you while rolling and side hopping, SVA was able to skip the entire ladder climb and all of the assorted tricks in the upstairs portion of the Pirate's Fortress. Instead, he simply shot the beehive from below with the bow. In Great Bay Temple, a completely new method of skipping the boss key was introduced. In the very first room of the temple, it was discovered that you can clip out of bounds with a very precise roll and an intentional death. After being revived by a fairy, you can simply recoil flip straight to the boss loading zone. This saved an enormous amount of time and, probably more importantly, required 0 bomb chews, completely obsoleting the old boss key skip. Power crouch stabbing was another technique introduced to the run at this time. On the Japanese version of the game, the crouch stab attack does not have a set amount of damage. Instead, it copies the attack power of the last attack you used. This was extremely useful for fighting basically every single enemy in the game, as it allowed you to store a Deku Stick jump slash as your crouch stab value. The Kokiri Sword's default attacks do 1 damage, and a Deku Stick jump slash does 4 damage. Storing this as your crouch stab value made some fights, like the Majora fight, much faster than they were on the English version. SVA's 147 would stand for a somewhat surprising amount of time. It was an excellent run to be sure, but there was certainly room for improvement even at the time. In September 2012, ZFG stepped up to the plate and made his mark on the history of Majora's Mask. It's not clear exactly when this was discovered, but ZFG's run was the first to attempt the Happy Mask Salesman cutscene skip. Tricks such as HMS are possible because most of the cutscenes in the game require 2 frames to begin. By pause buffering 1 frame at a time through cutscene triggers and into loading zones, you can override the cutscene with the loading zone. Using this technique, ZFG was able to skip the Happy Mask Salesman cutscene at the beginning of the run, saving approximately 40 seconds. ZFG also made much better use of early game rupees and explosives, requiring much less bomb farming and woodfall. By this time, bottle duping had also been made more consistent with the discovery that holding shield gives you an extra frame to perform the trick. However, none of these tricks could even hold a candle to the new trick that glitches and stuff discovered. If you play a song such as Song of Time and Void Out, the game stores that song. The next time a text box appears and is cleared, the song text that you stored will appear. By storing Song of Time and activating its text in boss rooms, you can actually save as you're picking up the boss remains and reset the game, skipping the post-temple cutscenes entirely. You still have to watch the post-temple cutscene of the first dungeon you beat to learn Oath to Order, but the other 3 cutscenes could be skipped. This alone saved over 5 minutes and was one of the biggest single time saves found in years. One consequence of this trick, though, is that resetting the game causes the clock to be reset to the dawn of the first day. This required ZFG to hover into the clock tower rather than manipulating the clock throughout the run such that it was already open after completing the temples. As if that weren't enough, a completely new trick known as the Weird Shot was introduced in this run as well. Weird Shots allow players to use first-person items such as the bow and the hook shot from out of bounds by using a damage source to dislocate the item's camera from Link's position. This technique allowed ZFG to Weird Shot past solid walls in Stone Tower Temple, saving a ridiculous amount of bomb chews. It also allowed the jewel at the beginning of the temple to be shot without the hover method found in previous runs, saving even more time and even more explosives. With all of these new tricks at his disposal, ZFG saved a massive 38 seconds over SVA's run, coming in at a 1:47.09. Just 5 days later, with the same exact route, ZFG proved exactly what the new route could do with a new time of 1:42.53. For the rest of 2012, no new records were set. It proved to be the calm before the storm, though, as a staggering 20 new records were set during 2013. On January 31st, 2013, a young Swede by the name of Enop112 entered the fray with a time of 1:42 even. He lowered that time down to a 1:41.09 the following day. Just over a week later, SVA himself lowered the time even further to a 1:40.20. On April 28th, 2013, Enop became the first runner to complete a run in under 1 hour and 40 minutes with a 1:39.36.
I don't know what to say. That's so cool. That's very cool.
The wrong songs.
For the most part, the route stayed the same, though some small changes were made. The Woodfall Rising cutscene skip was added, and a Weird Shot was added in Snowhead to avoid needing to do the precise hookshot for Scarecrow's skip. The biggest changes to the overall route structure came in SVA's 139.20 in early May 2013. SVA's run made much more efficient use of the Song of Soaring by only going back to Clocktown one time at the beginning of the second cycle. He purchased explosives for Woodfall and duped bottles in one trip rather than doing it in two separate trips. A new trick to hit the beehive by long jumping off the barrels with a bomb and using the Deku Mask allowed the Pirate's Fortress to be done before Woodfall. This run was also the first to utilize an RNG strategy in the final cycle. After reloading the game after the final temple, runners did not have any explosives to hover into the clock tower with or a stick to fight Majora with. Previously, runners obtained the rupees in East Clocktown and simply purchased the necessary supplies, but it turned out to be much faster to obtain the items in Termina Field. This saved an enormous amount of time, but it was completely reliant on luck, much to the chagrin of runners over the years. Another consequence of this RNG route was that runners no longer had access to bomb shoes in the final cycle. Using bomb shoes, you can unlock your camera while hovering and hover in a different direction than you started. Without that luxury, runners had to use the dog in Clocktown to serve the same purpose. Using this route, Enop and SVA continued to battle back and forth throughout April and early May 2013. On May 12, 2013, Enop obtained a time of 1:38.51, and for over 2 years he held the record uninterrupted other than a 12-hour period that we'll get to in a bit. In May 2013 alone, Enop set 4 new records, and with essentially the same route other than a few small optimizations, Enop closed out the year with a 1:34 flat on December 31st, 2013. During this time, the Pirates cutscene skip was found. By activating Time Stop using the fairy in the pot near the turtle, you can run into the cutscene trigger and then pause buffer your way into Zora Hall to skip the cutscene where the pirate's boat gets destroyed at sea. Another fairly large time save was the discovery of a clip through the sunblock at the beginning of Stone Tower Temple, which saved several bomb shoes, as well as a deathless Great Bay Temple boss key skip found by Joel the Dangerous. In 2014, ZFG ran Majora's Mask Any Percent at Awesome Games Done Quick, and this was the beginning of the Marathon Curse.
Special shout out to Enop.
For the next few years, a new major glitch was found after basically every marathon the game was in. In January of 2014, just a few days after ZFG's marathon run, Indextic found a glitch that came to be known as Index Warp. Contrary to popular belief, this name actually refers to Indextic himself and not any in-game indexes. In West Clocktown, you can see the owl that is supposed to represent the owl that is actually located in South Clocktown. This fake statue is actually a real statue, and you can activate it like any other by hovering around the loading zone to South Clocktown. If you've only hit this one hidden owl statue and you play the Song of Soaring, the game doesn't quite know which soaring destinations to show you to choose from. Incredibly, the game uses the cursor in the map subscreen in the pause menu to determine your soaring location in this situation. This was an absolutely monstrous breakthrough for Majora's Mask. It essentially allowed runners to soar anywhere at any time, even to owl statues they hadn't even been to yet. The most major use of this glitch was to soar to the top of Stone Tower Temple, completely eliminating all of the hovers there. This also completely changed the beginning of the run, as the most important item quickly became the Song of Soaring, so routes generally obtained it as quickly as possible. Therefore, runners used Time Stop to avoid the Skull Kid cutscene in Termina Field and went through the swamp rather than hovering over the fence to Great Bay. On January 18th, 2014, Enop used this new trick and obtained a time of 1:33.06. Later that day, SVA re-obtained the record for the first time in 8 months with a time of 1:33.02. SVA's record only lasted a little while though, as Enop re-obtained a 1:31.35 the following day. Not long after this, Enop achieved the first ever sub 130 with a 1:29.46.
So this is the first time Majora's Mask has been completed under an hour and 30 minutes. That's cool, I think. I am happy and I'm sad because I have to chug, but
Over the next few months, Enop optimized his time with this route all the way down to a 1:29.14. In March of 2014, another few new tricks were added to the run. As previously mentioned, most of the grottos exist on the same map. By hovering out of one, you can reach several other ones. To reach the Deku Palace quickly, a grotto warp from the Ocean Gossips Grotto in Termina Field to the Deku Palace was added to the run. Runners needed to collect the Sonata of Awakening anyway, and this grotto warp just so happened to place you right next to the area where you collect it. This also allowed several introduction cutscenes in the swamp to be skipped entirely. Not long after this, the Curiosity Shop was removed from the run entirely. A new technique for duplicating bottles was discovered by Skater that could be done essentially anywhere in the game. If you have a bottled item in hand and an item on a C button that makes an error sound when you try to use it, you can duplicate a bottle over that item's slot by holding ESS position and pressing the bottle followed by the other item one frame later. This cut out yet another trip to Clocktown. After these tricks were added to the run, the game suffered from a bit of a lull in new developments. The route and tricks remained almost exactly the same until January 2015, once again after an AGDQ run. Just a few days after Majin Phil's run at AGDQ 2015, a completely new Stone Tower Temple boss key skip was found by glitches and stuff. This new boss key skip required 0 bomb chews, which cut out yet another bomb shop trip from the run. With this new development, Enop lowered his time all the way down to a 1:27:09 with several intermediate world records along the way. Around this time, community member Jimmy1717 began to develop practice cheats for the game. These cheats allowed for things such as infinite explosives and position saving and loading. These cheats would prove to be invaluable to runners as they allowed for much more efficient practice. Without these practice cheats, it's unlikely the world record would have progressed nearly as quickly as it ended up progressing. The community owes a lot to Jimmy, so it was very important to me to recognize him here. In May of 2015, Enop would lose the record for the first time in over 2 years. A smart, handsome, incredibly charismatic runner by the name of Fullgrown Gaming stormed onto the scene and took the mantle with a time of 1:27:03. I used the same overall route that Enop used, but I used the much harder Swamp Gossip Grotto rather than the Ocean Gossips Grotto. The Swamp Grotto uses significantly fewer bomb chews, which allowed for the removal of another entire trip to Clocktown later in the run. I also used a new version of the Woodfall boss key skip that utilized a new trick known as ledge clipping, which was also discovered by Skater. The upstairs version of the trick is faster with a low bomb chew count, which goes hand in hand with the removal of the trip to Clocktown that I just mentioned. Finally, in Snowhead, I used another new trick known as Action Swap. Action Swap is so complex that it deserves its own video, but suffice it to say that I used it to melt the ice at the beginning of Snowhead. This saves about 15 seconds compared to the previous Weird Shot strategy, but it brought back the ridiculously precise Scarecrow skip. These additions to the run would be the last for several years. It was absolutely unbelievable how resilient the route became to changes at this point in time. Using this route and the exact same tricks, runner Finir took the record on June 8th, 2015 with a time of 1:27:02. Several weeks later, Enop regained the throne with a 1:26:07, and about a month later, Furniture took the record back with a 1:25:52. Over the next year, Finir lowered his time to a 1:24:50, and that time stood for a very long time. This run seemed nigh unbeatable at the time, and it took Enop's return in late 2016 for someone to finally beat it. On December 6th, 2016, Enop retook the record yet again with a 1:24:43. From early 2015 to the middle of 2017, the Majora's Mask any percent route did not change in any appreciable way. After Enop's 1:24:43, the category was dead. Very few top runners were running the category, instead opting to run other categories like 100%. Despite the best efforts of members of the community to find something to breathe new life into the category, nothing seemed to pan out. It would take a find on the level of Index Warp to do that, and the game simply didn't have anything like that remaining to be found. Or did it? In August of 2017, Exodus replicated a somewhat old glitch that came to be known as Equip Swap.
So I'm going to put it on Deku Stick. On a certain frame, it might be slightly more lenient, but I know on one frame it works. You want to hold down left and hold a C button. This frame, I'm holding down left and the C button. And it'll equip the Deku Stick instead of the Pocket Egg.
It was originally found in Ocarina of Time, but due to the similarities between the games, it works in Majora's Mask as well. If you highlight a particular item and move to a different subscreen and then scroll back to the subscreen you highlighted the item on, there is a 1-frame window to input a direction and a C button. If done correctly, the item you previously highlighted will be equipped over the wrong slot, preserving the original item. This was absolutely huge for Majora's Mask speedrunning because it allowed for the duplication of any item, which allowed runners to obtain just one Zora egg rather than the 7 we used to have to collect. On August 15th, 2017, runner TrevPerson was the first to complete a run with this new trick, obtaining a new world record of 122.57.
122! Almost choked it, but I didn't. Alright, there we go, I'm done. Good night, everyone! No. I present to you Majora's Mask Any Percent's world record for the next half an hour.
Incidentally, Trev also set the record for the shortest lived world record, as Enop retook the record mere hours later with a 121.48. To be fair to Trev, Enop's run already used an entirely different route despite being done on the same day. To work, Equip Swap requires an item in the top or bottom row of the item or mask subscreen to duplicate the eggs over. When Trev completed his run, the Moons tier was the item of choice. Very quickly, it was seen that duping over the Deku mask like the good old days was going to be a much better choice. To facilitate this, Enop grabbed the Bremen mask on his way to the Swamp Gossip Grotto. The Bremen mask was required again because the item you want to duplicate and the item you're duping over have to be on the same subscreen, and the Bremen mask is the most readily available mask. Using this route, Enop lowered the record to a 121.22 on August 23rd, 2017. Overall, the route was largely the same as it used to be before Equip Swap. However, this was only the beginning of the Majora's Mask Any Percent reroutes of 2017 and 2018. In late August 2017, a core team of myself, Imbued, and Gigopolar routed the hookshot completely out of the run. Although the hookshot is very useful in many places, it doesn't save enough time to outweigh the time it takes to get it in the first place. Obtaining an egg from Pinnacle Rock and avoiding the need for the hookshot by hovering was significantly faster than obtaining the hookshot. This removed the pirate cutscene skip from the run entirely, as hovering onto the turtle twice was slower than simply watching the cutscene. At the time, this cutscene skip was complete RNG due to the fairy that it required, so this was met with joy in the community. In addition to this, the community realized other items could be equip swapped and used effectively. One major use of this was keeping explosives even after resetting using a trick known affectionately as item crap. If you equip swap an item such as bomb shoes and duplicate a bottle over the real bomb shoes inventory slot, the game does not reset your bomb shoe count to 0 when you play Song of Time. This was extraordinarily useful as it allowed us to keep bomb shoes after the reset at the end of Stone Tower Temple to be used to hover into the clock tower. This removed the need to gather supplies in Termina Field at the end of the cycle, although it did mean fighting Majora without a stick. This greatly increased the likelihood of bad RNG leading to a bad fight. With these new tricks, Enop set a record of 120.15 on September 19th, 2017. Unsurprisingly, Enop became the first to sub 120 on September 24th, 2017, and he settled on a time of 119.50 before the next huge set of changes came. The next major change to the route was an offshoot of the removal of the hookshot. The main reason the community switched to the Japanese version in the first place is that obtaining the hookshot on the English version is much slower than it is on the Japanese version. Given that the hookshot was now proven to be slower, we quickly realized that the English version likely should be looked into again. Throughout October 2017, it was shown that the English version was, perhaps surprisingly, faster again. In Majora's Mask, almost all of the text boxes in the game are shown in a single frame, removing the advantage that Japanese games often have. In fact, the English version has tricks that the Japanese version does not have. On the English version, the Song of Double Time can be used to skip several cutscenes throughout the run, such as the one where Mikau slowly walks along the Great Bay shore. Also, remember how hard English Lullaby skip was? That still applies, but the English version actually does have an advantage over the Japanese version. On the English version, hessing into a ledge does not set your speed to 0 such as it does on the Japanese version. This made Lullaby skip quite a bit faster than its JP counterpart because a hess could be done from the Fairy Fountain entrance rather than walking and super sliding. Finally, the Bremen mask was removed from the run again. Instead, Gigopolar worked out a route where eggs would be duped over the bow's inventory slot. It turns out that you can actually do a double equip swap. This allowed the bow to be used for both duping eggs and for skipping Gyorg's introduction cutscene with a weird shot. If you shoot Gyorg from above before the fight starts, his introduction cutscene never plays. Later in the run, fire arrows are obtained, and those function properly even if you have a bottle over your normal bow slot. This set of changes also saw the introduction of the first new dungeon order in years. As it turns out, the Woodfall cutscene isn't that long, and completing Woodfall in one trip is faster than completing it in 2 trips just to skip its post-temple cutscenes. Therefore, the new dungeon order was Woodfall, Great Bay, Snowhead, and then Stone Tower. Unfortunately, the English version introduced a large amount of RNG on the Majora fight. On the English version of the game, power crouch stabbing was patched. This not only makes the Majora fight slower, but it also makes the Incarnation and Wrath phases significantly harder. Strategies were worked out to mitigate this new RNG, but runs are still regularly lost to Majora to this day. In October 2017, NOP completed a run with all of these changes in 1:19:39. About a week later, on November 5th, The Sausage, another relative newcomer to the scene, took the record with a 1:19:17. Not to be outdone, NOP regained the record yet again on November 28th. With this route, NOP whittled the record down to a 1:17:53 obtained on January 9th, 2018. In January 2018, the last major route changes were introduced. The game overwrites items in bottles when Song of Time is played, but this does not apply to duplicated bottles. By catching the egg in a duplicated bottle, the Zora egg could be kept until it needed to be used. This allowed Great Bay Temple to be done last. Long story short, this reroute allowed Woodfall Temple and Snowhead Temple to be completed with one trip to the bomb shop, removing yet another bomb shop trip from the run. This also allowed eggs to be duped over light arrows, which were basically useless at that point in the run anyway. The witch bottle was moved to after Woodfall Temple rather than before it, which saved about 8 seconds. The biggest change by far, though, was the addition of the Snowhead Owl Hess. Way back in 2009, Giano and friends theorized that this should be possible, but it took the better part of 10 years for the route to mature enough and for runners to become skilled enough to actually make it happen in runs. To reiterate, on the English version of the game, your speed is not set to 0 when you Hess along an edge. Because of this, it is more than possible to do a Hess all the way from the Snowhead Owl, rather than doing a Fairy Fountain alternate exit to get in position to perform Lullaby Skip. This saves an enormous amount of time, but it is easily the hardest trick to be added to any percent in its entire history. Runners have gotten quite good at it since it was introduced, but it is still easily the biggest run killer. With this new route, NOP obtained a 1:17:28 on February 13th. Throughout the first half of 2018, NOP set several new records before settling on a 1:15:59 on July 25th, 2018. This is the current record as of April 2019.
We'll do 100 points. This is the first time in speedrunning this game for 6 years that I actually accomplished one of my goal times.
Oh my god.
Well, that's pretty cool. But yeah, this run sucked.
Oh my god.
But it didn't suck enough.
This is not the end of the Majora's Mask any percent story, however. In July 2018, a new trick known as Bank Clip was found by glitches and stuff as a result of some science that Blinny and friends were working on in Ocarina of Time. Bank Clip is an alternative way to reach the Hidden Owl statue that requires just one bomb shoe rather than the 8 the previous method required. A new route pioneered by The Sausage was introduced using this new route in late 2018. Overall, the new route is much more difficult as it stretches explosive counts to their absolute limits. In this latest route, there are only 2 trips to the bomb shop in the entire run. Currently, NOP is still actively running the game with this route, and his current goal is a 1:14. There are others in close competition as well, such as Pope Squidward, Twitch Kiko, The Sausage, and the Human Protractor, among others. And to be honest, with the history of the game, we really never know when a new runner might pop up. Majora's Mask any percent is in better shape now than it has ever been. The run is difficult, but manageable, and the random elements of the run have been kept to a relative minimum. It cannot be understated how much work went into making the run what it has been over the years. Not only from runners, but from those behind the scenes, such as glitch hunters, scientists, routers, and everyone in between. The Majora's Mask community truly is one of the best I've ever personally been a part of due to its incredibly dedicated members. As of right now, the current route is fresh, and no one quite knows how good the record will end up being. What is certain, though, is that we will continue to grind, innovate, and overcome stubborn routing obstacles in the never-ending pursuit of a faster run.